Garbage doesn't get a voice in this room. The words cracked across the 42nd floor boardroom so sharply even the HVAC hum seemed to recoil. Richard Whitmore didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. Men used to being obeyed rarely did. His silver cuff links caught the cold morning light as he pointed toward Naomi Carter standing near the polished walnut doors, a maintenance badge clipped to her navy uniform, a sanitation cart parked just outside like evidence she didn't belong. Around the 18-foot conference table, directors shifted, some with smirks they tried to hide, others lowering their eyes into merger packets thick as bricks. Manhattan shimmered through the glass wall behind them, winter sun bouncing off steel towers, hard and white. Naomi felt heat rise in her face, but she did not move. Her hand tightened around a folder worn soft at the corners. She had spent 3 nights debating whether to walk into this room. 3 nights listening to the old radiator hiss in her mother's apartment in Newark, rereading numbers no one else seemed to see. Richard turned back toward the signature page, Montblanc pen poised over a $2 billion acquisition that would make headlines by noon. Security, someone murmured near the end of the table. But before anyone stood, Naomi heard her own voice enter the silence, calm enough to frighten even herself. "Sir, if you sign that agreement, your chief financial officer just sold this company from inside." The room froze. Not metaphorically. Froze. A woman in pearls stopped mid-breath. A junior analyst's hand hung over a laptop trackpad, suspended. Even the city outside looked paused behind the glass. Richard slowly lowered the pen. His pale blue eyes lifted to her as if seeing her for the first time. "What did you say?" he asked, not loud, but sharpened. Naomi stepped forward one measured pace, sneaker sole whispering over marble. She was 26, daughter of a hospital janitor, former risk analysis student who had dropped out after medical debt swallowed tuition. None of that was visible in the uniform they saw. Only she knew what years of studying SEC filings at public libraries had made possible. Clause 14 subsection C, she said. The indemnity transfer doesn't protect Whitmore Global. It shifts liability to you while preserving offshore control for the buyer. It looks legal. It's a trap. Someone laughed nervously. Richard's CFO, Daniel Mercer, leaned back in Italian leather and folded his hands too carefully. "Are we taking compliance advice from housekeeping now?" he said. A ripple of uneasy chuckles followed. Naomi looked at him, and for a second something in her stillness unsettled the room more than any accusation. "You buried the override in the debt waterfall," she said. Page 78. Richard's jaw tightened. 10 minutes earlier he had been thinking about stock price and private jets to Aspen. Now a maintenance worker had spoken into the machinery of power and jammed the gears. "Escort her out," Mercer snapped, too quickly. But Richard didn't echo it. His fingers hovered over the document. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat, slow and heavy, like footsteps in a long hallway. She remembered her mother saying dignity was what you held when people tried to name you less. Richard opened the packet. Page 78. A paper edge lifted under his thumb. Sunlight shifted across the table. Somewhere deep in the building an elevator bell chimed. And in the growing silence, before anyone knew whether Naomi Carter had just ended her job or saved an empire, the CEO who had called her garbage stopped breathing long enough to read. Richard Whitmore did not look up at first. His thumb held page 78 in place as though the paper itself might move if released. The conference room had become so still Naomi could hear the faint ticking of the antique regulator clock mounted near the glass bar, a relic Richard had once called the only honest thing in finance because it never lied about time. Now time seemed to lean over his shoulder. His eyes tracked the paragraph once, then again slower, and something almost imperceptible changed in his face. Not panic. Worse. Recognition. Daniel Mercer shifted in his chair. "This is being misread," he said too quickly, his polished tone developing a hairline crack. But Richard lifted one hand. Without looking at him, a small motion that silenced a man who had not been interrupted in 15 years. Naomi stayed standing where she was, shoulders square, every instinct telling her she had crossed too far and yet some older steadier instinct telling her truth did not retreat once spoken. Richard turned another page. Then another. The thick merger packet made a dry whisper against the table. "Who drafted the waterfall exposure revisions?" he asked. His voice had gone low, dangerous in a different way now, stripped of performance. Mercer gave a thin smile. Outside counsel reviewed all revisions. Richard finally raised his eyes. "That was not my question." The directors around the table exchanged glances sharpened by fear. One older board member pulled the document closer and began reading, lips moving silently. Naomi noticed his wedding band tapping against the paper. Tiny sounds suddenly mattered. Air vents. Cloth shifting. Breath. Richard leaned back slowly, pen still in hand, but now it looked less like authority and more like a thing forgotten. "How did you catch this?" he asked, and the question landed on Naomi with more force than the insult had. Not because it was kind. Because it was genuine. She swallowed. "I was clearing recycling from legal last night. A draft was left in a redline folder. The liability percentages changed between versions. I checked the SEC disclosures before dawn." Someone near the end of the table whispered, "My God." Mercer laughed once, brittle. "She is a janitor with internet access." Naomi turned toward him. Her voice did not rise. "No, sir. I am a woman who reads what powerful people assume no one else will." Silence followed so complete it seemed to alter the light. Winter sun moved across the tabletop and reached Richard's hand. He stared at Naomi as if recalculating the room itself. Then he looked at Mercer. "Did you think I would sign this blind?" Mercer opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time his confidence seemed too expensive, too polished to be real. Richard pressed a button on the speakerphone. "Cancel the signing." Gasps were almost inaudible, but Naomi heard them. A $2 billion ceremony stopped. By 6 words. Somewhere 40 floors below, elevators carried employees through ordinary mornings unaware an empire had just swerved. Richard stood. At 6'2" he usually seemed to fill a room through sheer control. Now something else filled it. Suspicion. Moral gravity. He walked to the glass wall and looked out over the East River flashing silver in winter light. "Miss Carter," he said without turning, testing her name as though it belonged in a vocabulary he had neglected. "Stay where you are." Security, who had arrived moments earlier expecting removal, remained frozen by the door. No one moved. Naomi felt the old maintenance badge against her chest, suddenly absurdly small. She had entered as invisible labor. She was now the axis of the room. And while Richard stared at the city he had long believed obeyed him, another realization began settling over the boardroom colder than January glass. The danger had not come from outside the company. It had been sitting at the table. No one returned to their seats. The boardroom had crossed into another kind of weather. Daniel Mercer remained motionless except for one finger tapping once against the leather armrest before stopping, a small betrayal of nerves from a man known for none. Richard Whitmore turned from the glass and walked back to the table with a deliberateness that made even his footsteps sound measured. He did not sit. He placed both palms on the walnut surface and looked first at the directors, then at Mercer. "Pull the transaction history on every offshore entity attached to Vaughn Capital," he said. No one moved for half a breath, stunned perhaps by the fact he was issuing orders not to protect the deal but to question it. Then screens lit. Laptops opened. A compliance officer near the far end began typing with trembling precision. Naomi stood beside the door, still in uniform, still carrying the scent of industrial lemon cleaner on her sleeves, and felt the surreal weight of watching executives obey a warning they would have mocked 10 minutes earlier. Richard turned to her again. "You said the percentages changed between drafts." Explain. Naomi stepped closer to the table, the board packets spread before her like a landscape she had studied in secret. She pointed to two figures buried in annex schedules. This liability share was 18% in the red line. In the final version it becomes 81 through contingent rollover debt. It is disguised through subsidiary layering. A woman from audit inhaled sharply. That would bankrupt the parent on default. Naomi nodded. That is why it was hidden. Mercer gave a low scoff, but it landed hollow. You are speculating from partial information. Richard did not even look at him. And yet she is the only one in this room who noticed. The sentence cut deeper than accusation. It redistributed shame. Naomi felt something strange move through her chest, not triumph, something quieter. Being heard. A junior associate suddenly pushed back from the table. Sir, he said, staring at his monitor, there are wire transfers from a shell in Bermuda linked to Mercer Advisory. The room did not gasp this time. It tightened. Richard took 2 steps toward the screen. The reflection of numbers flickered across his face. Mercer rose halfway from his chair. This is procedural noise. But his voice had lost the smooth certainty that once carried rooms. Richard spoke so softly people leaned in to hear. How long? Mercer said nothing. Outside the windows a helicopter drifted over the river, tiny against winter haze. Naomi noticed absurd details in moments of rupture, the way sunlight had warmed one corner of the table, the smell of burnt coffee from a silver service tray untouched since morning. The world never stopped during revelations. It merely exposed itself. Richard straightened. General counsel to my office in 15 minutes. Independent forensic review effective now. He paused, then looked directly at Naomi. Miss Carter, walk with me. The invitation stunned the room more than the cancelled signing had. A maintenance worker being asked to leave beside the chief executive, not escorted out but summoned in. As Richard moved toward the doors, Mercer finally spoke, voice edged with desperation. You are trusting a custodian over your own chief financial officer. Richard stopped without turning. Today, he said, I am trusting the only person who told me the truth. The doors opened. Marble hallway light spilled in cool and white. Naomi followed, heartbeat steadying into something like resolve. As they walked past portraits of former chairmen framed in gold, Richard did not speak for several yards. Then, near the private elevator, he asked a question no one in power had ever asked her before. Who taught you to read risk like that? Naomi thought of late nights at a library in Newark, her mother asleep on a worn sofa, old textbooks marked in pencil. She answered simply. Hunger did. Richard said nothing, but something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Behind them, on the 42nd floor, a boardroom built on hierarchy had begun learning the cost of underestimating the invisible. The private elevator rose without sound, smooth as thought, carrying Naomi and Richard toward the executive floor few employees ever saw. Stainless steel walls reflected them side by side in strange symmetry, a billionaire in a charcoal suit and a maintenance worker in rubber-soled shoes, 2 lives never meant to occupy the same frame. Richard kept his eyes forward until the doors opened onto the 46th floor, where the carpeting softened every footstep and original oil paintings watched from cream walls under museum lights. Naomi had dusted hallways below these offices but had never crossed this threshold. It smelled faintly of cedar and espresso. Richard led her into a corner office larger than her mother's apartment, windows wrapping around lower Manhattan where ferries moved like white stitches across the harbor. He did not go behind his desk. Instead he placed the merger binder open across a conference table and motioned for Naomi to sit. She hesitated. Men like him did not ask women like her to take a seat as equals. Sit, Miss Carter, he said again, softer this time. She obeyed. For a long moment he studied her as if searching for how he had missed what was now undeniable. Why are you cleaning office floors if you can dissect contingent liabilities, he asked. Naomi folded her hands, noticing a faint detergent crack in her knuckles. Graduate school ended. When hospital bills started. Richard looked down. Your mother. She nodded. Dialysis 3 times a week. The words landed with no plea in them, only fact. He seemed almost unsettled by the absence of self-pity. Before he could respond, the door opened and General Counsel entered with 2 compliance attorneys carrying tablets and sealed folders. Their surprise at seeing Naomi seated at the table flickered, then vanished behind professionalism. Richard wasted no time. Miss Carter will walk us through the override structure. Even the phrasing altered gravity in the room. Naomi will walk us through. Not help. Not observe. Lead. She leaned over the documents and traced the debt cascade line by line, voice growing steadier with each explanation. She spoke of rollover triggers, shadow entities, exposure corridors hidden beneath arbitration language. The attorneys began asking her questions not out of courtesy but because they needed answers. One of them, a white-haired woman named Ellen Rhodes who had argued before federal regulators, stopped midway and removed her glasses. This analysis is sound, she said quietly. Richard's gaze moved from Ellen to Naomi and lingered. The old hierarchy kept cracking. Then another discovery arrived. A compliance officer rushed in with preliminary transfer records linking Mercer to bonus compensation routed through the acquiring firm. The room tightened again. Richard read the summary, face hardening into something colder than anger. Betrayal had become evidence. Yet amid that escalation, Naomi noticed a framed photograph on a side credenza, Richard years younger beside a black man in army dress uniform. Her eyes rested there only a second, but Richard caught it. My father, he said unexpectedly. First person who taught me integrity. He gave a humorless breath. Today I nearly ignored it. The admission hung in the room with startling humility. Ellen closed the binder. If she had stayed silent, you would have signed. Richard looked at Naomi. Yes. No embellishment. Just truth stripped bare. Then he did something none of the attorneys expected. He slid a legal pad toward Naomi. Show me where Mercer moves next if cornered. It was not a test. It was trust. Naomi drew a sequence of shell exits and probable document destruction windows from memory. Ellen stared, impressed beyond concealment. Where did you learn to think 3 moves ahead? Naomi answered without lifting her pen. When life gives you no margin, you learn risk before comfort. Richard leaned back slowly, absorbing not just her skill but the moral weight of what his contempt had almost discarded. Outside, afternoon light had warmed from steel white to amber, throwing long bars across the carpet. The city below kept rushing, horns distant as surf, while in that high quiet office a new reversal was forming. Naomi had entered the building invisible. Now powerful people were taking notes while she spoke. By late afternoon the executive floor no longer felt insulated from consequence. It felt hunted. Phones rang in clipped bursts. Compliance staff moved in and out carrying printouts still warm from the copier. The soft hush of wealth had given way to the quiet urgency of exposure. Naomi remained at the conference table beside Ellen Rhodes while Richard stood near the windows reading a forensic memo line by line. The amber light had deepened, reflecting gold against the harbor, and for a moment the office seemed suspended between ruin and reckoning. Then the door opened without warning. Daniel Mercer stepped in. No assistant announced him. No knock softened his arrival. His tie had loosened, though his posture fought to preserve command. Richard, we need to discuss this privately, he said. The room chilled. Richard did not invite him farther. There is nothing private about attempted betrayal. Mercer's jaw tightened. His gaze shifted to Naomi with a contempt sharpened now by fear. This entire circus exists because a custodian decided to play analyst. Naomi met his stare but said nothing. Silence could be a form of dignity. Mercer stepped toward the table. Do you know what happens to markets if this deal collapses today? Employees lose pensions. Funds crater. You are letting sentiment destroy strategy. Ellen closed a folder with deliberate calm. Fraud is not strategy. Mercer ignored her. Richard, you are trusting someone who found scraps in recycling bins over a man who built your balance sheet. Richard's reply came almost weary in its certainty. No. I am trusting the person who risked everything with nothing to gain. The words landed like a verdict. Mercer's face hardened. For one dangerous second Naomi sensed not violence, but the coldness of a man watching control slip through his fingers. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Thin. Almost pitying. Then ask her who fed her those numbers. Naomi felt the accusation strike the room. Mercer pressed on. You think a maintenance worker independently mapped shell structures tied to sovereign debt corridors? Come on, Richard. She is someone's instrument. The attack was elegant because it aimed not at her evidence but her credibility. A subtler cruelty. Richard looked at Naomi, not suspicious, but measuring what the lie hoped to wound. Naomi stood. Her chair moved softly over carpet. Sir, she said to Richard, though her eyes never left Mercer, if truth from someone in a uniform sounds impossible, that says more about the room than the truth. Ellen inhaled faintly, as if witnessing something moral rise beyond legal argument. Mercer gave a mocking laugh. Poetic. Naomi took one step closer to the transfer record spread on the table and placed her finger on a highlighted routing code. Your shell company repeats a clerical identifier from Mercer Advisory payroll filings. Same 6-digit sequence. Fraud hides in patterns, not drama. Ellen looked down and whispered, almost to herself, she caught the metadata. Richard slowly turned toward Mercer. Whatever defense Mercer had prepared seemed suddenly too small. Yet he made one final move. Even if she is right, you cannot let this become public. The board will blame you for missing it. It was temptation now, not denial. Save reputation. Bury truth. The oldest test of power. Richard walked to the desk and pressed the intercom. Corporate security to executive conference. Mercer's face changed, not collapsing, but emptying. A man realizing the architecture protecting him had vanished. When security arrived, no one touched him. They simply stood waiting. Mercer looked once more at Naomi. Do not think they will ever let you belong here. The cruelty in it came from knowing the wound history leaves. But Naomi answered before anyone else could. Belonging is not granted by rooms built on exclusion. Even Richard looked at her then with something beyond admiration, something like shame learning respect. Mercer was escorted out, his footsteps fading down the hall. After the door closed, no one spoke for several seconds. Only the city murmured below. Then Richard lowered himself into a chair as though years had settled onto his shoulders in an hour. He looked at Naomi and said quietly, almost stunned by his own words, today you did not just save this company. You exposed me to myself. Night settled over lower Manhattan in slow layers of blue glass and reflected gold. The rush that had consumed the executive floor thinned into a hush broken only by distant printers and the muted roll of traffic far below. Most of the attorneys had gone. Ellen Rhodes left a stack of marked files beside Richard with a quiet nod and disappeared down the corridor, leaving behind the faint scent of paper and old perfume. Naomi remained by the windows, looking out over the East River where lights trembled in the black water like thoughts too fragile to hold. For the first time all day, no one was arguing. No alarms. No accusations. Only breath and consequence. Richard sat at the long table without his jacket now, tie loosened, the architecture of command around him softened by exhaustion. He seemed older in stillness. Human in a way power often conceals. After a long silence he asked, "Do you know what I saw when you walked into that boardroom this morning?" Naomi turned but did not answer. His gaze stayed on the dark window reflection rather than her face. A disruption. An inconvenience. Someone beneath notice. The words came without defense. Confession more than explanation. Naomi looked at the city again. That is what many people see first. Richard let out a breath almost like regret. And what should I have seen? She considered before speaking, not to wound but to tell truth as she always had. A person carrying a warning. Silence. Returned, but warmer now. The office lamps cast amber pools across the carpet, and somewhere beyond the closed doors a cleaning cart rolled softly past, wheels whispering over the hallway. The sound made Naomi smile faintly. Richard noticed. Your shift, he said. You were supposed to be emptying trash cans while all this happened. Yes, sir. He almost winced at the title. After today I think Richard will do. It was such a small sentence, yet it altered the room. Naomi moved toward the conference table and sat again, no longer hesitating. Richard opened a drawer and took out an old fountain pen, worn at the grip. My father gave me this when I took over the company. He said, never sign what your conscience has not read. He turned the pen in his fingers. I ignored him today until you spoke. Naomi looked at the pen, then at him. Maybe you remembered in time. Outside, a fairy horn drifted up from the river, low and mournful. Richard leaned back and studied her with a seriousness that carried none of the coldness from mourning. What did you want before life interrupted? The question startled her because no executive had ever asked about wanting, only utility. I wanted to finish law school, she said. Corporate accountability. Richard nodded slowly as though pieces were aligning. You may still. He slid a folder across the table. Naomi opened it. Inside was a temporary consulting authorization prepared in haste, her name typed above the word Strategic Risk Review. She stared at it, unable to speak. This is not charity, Richard said quietly. This is correction. Her eyes moved over the paper while emotion gathered but did not spill. The room held that fragile pause where lives begin changing before anyone names it. Then Richard rose and walked to the window beside her. They stood shoulder to shoulder looking over a city neither fully understood anymore. After a while he said, almost to himself, Mercer told you this world would never let you belong here. Naomi answered with a softness stronger than defiance. Belonging is not the prize. Integrity is. Richard nodded, and for a long moment both listened to the silence between buildings, to wind moving around steel towers, to the strange peace that follows moral storm. In the glass reflection Naomi could see them standing there, not as CEO and custodian now, but as two people altered by a truth one had nearly dismissed and the other had risked everything to speak. The next morning arrived with a pale winter sun pouring across the river and striking the Whitmore Tower in sheets of silver. By 8 o'clock the executive boardroom had filled again, but nothing in it resembled the room Naomi had entered the day before. The same walnut table. The same skyline. Yet the atmosphere had changed from authority to reckoning. News had not broken publicly, but rumors moved through the building faster than elevators. Compliance reports were stacked in ordered rows. Independent auditors occupied seats once reserved for Mercer's allies. And for the first time in company history, Naomi Carter was invited through the front glass doors instead of the service entrance. She wore the same Navy uniform because she had not gone home to become anyone else. But something in the way reception stood when she passed told her invisibility had already begun to dissolve. Richard Whitmore entered moments later, not with his usual entourage but alone, carrying only a slim leather folder. Conversation stopped. He remained standing rather than taking the head chair. Before this board votes on emergency restructuring, he said, voice calm but carrying to every corner, there is a matter of truth I failed yesterday to honor soon enough. The directors listened, uncertain. Richard turned toward Naomi seated midway down the table beside Ellen Rhodes. I publicly insulted the person who prevented catastrophic fraud inside this company. A stunned quiet followed. Public men rarely confess where power can hear it. Richard continued, and because integrity should be recognized where rank once blinded us, Miss Naomi Carter will present the risk mitigation framework this morning. Heads turned toward her. Several board members who had smirked the day before now looked almost embarrassed to meet her eyes. Naomi rose slowly, pulse steady but strong. She walked to the front screen where her analysis had been formatted overnight into formal review slides. The irony nearly made her smile. Ideas once ignored were now projected 30 feet wide. She began speaking. Not dramatically. Clearly. Exposure corridors. Recovery sequencing. Governance controls to prevent hidden override clauses. Her voice carried a precision that made even skeptical directors lean in. Questions came. She answered them. A pension trustee challenged assumptions. She improved them. An outside auditor asked how she modeled fraud propagation. She drew the logic in real time. By the third exchange, no one in the room was indulging a symbolic gesture. They were listening to expertise. Then came the twist no one expected. Mid-presentation Ellen received a message and slid her phone toward Richard. His expression sharpened. He stood. Mercer attempted overnight transfers through a secondary trust. Murmurs rippled. Naomi looked at the flow chart still glowing on the screen and realized she had predicted the route exactly in Richard's office. Richard faced the board. Miss Carter anticipated this 12 hours ago. The room shifted from respect into awe. One elderly director removed his glasses and said softly, "Good Lord." Richard looked at Naomi not as benefactor but witness. "You did not just identify fraud," he said. "You predicted betrayal after exposure." That was the second reversal. Not merely she had been right. She had seen farther than the people paid millions to guard risk. After the vote to suspend Mercer's authority passed unanimously, Richard did something even more unexpected. He did not return to the head chair. Instead he moved one seat down and gestured toward the place beside him. "Miss Carter, join the governance committee discussion." It was a symbolic act, yes, but also operational. A seat at the table. Naomi hesitated only a second before sitting there under the city light where no one like her had sat before. Through the glass, gulls wheeled over the river in winter wind. Inside, power had shifted without spectacle, only truth accumulating until hierarchy could no longer resist it. And as the meeting resumed, one fact settled over everyone present with the hush of moral revelation. The woman called Garbage had become the clearest mind in the room. The meeting ended near dusk, but few people rushed for elevators. Something larger than corporate crisis had passed through the room, and even those who did not understand it seemed reluctant to break its spell. Directors lingered in clusters speaking softer than usual, as if ordinary volume might disturb what had been restored. Naomi gathered her papers slowly, still adjusting to the unreality of hearing board members ask for her opinion as though it belonged naturally among theirs. The city beyond the glass had turned amber and blue again, a full day folded almost exactly onto the one before, yet nothing in her life stood where it had stood yesterday morning. As she slipped the consulting authorization back into its folder, Richard approached carrying no documents this time, only the old fountain pen she had seen in his office. "Walk with me," he said. They moved through the executive corridor where evening light stretched across polished floors in long gold bands. At the end of the hall stood a quiet lounge rarely used except by senior partners, walls lined with law books and framed black and white photographs from decades of the company's history. Richard stopped before one photograph showing workers raising the tower steel in 1962. Men in overalls, lunch pails in hand, faces anonymous to history. "My father started in maintenance before he ever wore a suit," he said. Naomi looked at him, surprised. "You never mentioned that." A faint rueful smile touched him. "There are many things pride edits out." They sat near the window overlooking the harbor. For a while neither spoke. Silence no longer felt fragile between them. It felt earned. Then Richard placed the fountain pen on the table between them. I owe you an apology that cannot be hidden behind promotion or gratitude. Naomi remained still. His voice lowered. When I called you garbage, I was speaking from a poverty of character, not superiority. The words carried no performance. Only remorse. She had imagined many reversals. Not this. You do not owe me humiliation repeated, she said gently. Only truth. Richard nodded. Then here is truth. I was wrong about you before you spoke a word. He pushed the pen toward her. I want you to keep this. Naomi shook her head at once. It belongs to your father. He valued integrity over inheritance, Richard replied. Today that means it belongs with you. Her fingers hovered over the worn barrel but did not take it yet. Emotion moved through her face in quiet currents she kept disciplined. Why are you doing this? She asked. Richard answered without hesitation. Because gratitude without humility becomes theater. Outside a tugboat moved slowly along the river leaving a silver wake in dusk light. Naomi finally picked up the pen, turning it once in her hand. Then she did something Richard did not expect. I will accept this, she said, if you accept something too. Name it. She met his eyes. Do not rescue me. Open doors for others you were taught not to see. Richard's expression changed, as if the deeper lesson had only now arrived. Done, he said. And in that simple word lay something close to redemption. Later, as they walked back toward the elevators, Richard stopped outside a conference room and handed Naomi a new badge packet prepared by Human Resources. Inside, beneath temporary credentials, a title read Strategic Risk Advisor. Naomi stared at it, stunned all over again. You did this already? He gave the smallest smile. I started when you told me hunger taught you risk. At the elevator she turned to him. After everything Mercer said, you trust me this much? Richard looked almost offended by the question. No, he said. I trust truth that much. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As Naomi stepped inside, Richard remained in the hallway watching the doors begin to close. Just before they met, he said words that seemed to suspend in the narrowing light. Miss Carter, thank you for saving more than a company. And as the elevator descended, Naomi understood forgiveness had not come through triumph over power, but through changing the heart that once misused it. Morning entered the city in a soft gray wash a week later, the kind of winter light that made glass towers look almost gentle. Snow from the night before clung in thin white seams along ledges and traffic medians, already melting where the sun touched stone. Naomi Carter walked through the front lobby of Whitmore Global with an access badge resting against her coat, not swinging from a visitor lanyard now but clipped with quiet permanence. The revolving doors turned behind her with a muted breath of cold air. Security nodded as she passed. No ceremony. No announcement. Just ordinary acknowledgement, and somehow that felt larger than applause. On the 42nd floor the boardroom stood empty before the day's first meeting, chairs aligned, screens dark, the long walnut table carrying only the sheen of early light. Naomi paused at the threshold where days earlier she had been named less than human. The room held no echo of insult now, only silence and winter sun stretching across polished wood. She set a folder at one seat and, almost unconsciously, straightened a misplaced document left by someone from the night before. Old habits of care survived transformation. Beyond the glass wall the East River moved in slow silver ribbons. A ferry crossed, leaving a wake that widened and disappeared. Richard Whitmore entered a few minutes later without sound enough for her to notice until he stood beside the windows, hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the water. His posture had changed in ways only stillness reveals. Less armored. The hard economy of control replaced by something quieter. He did not interrupt her work. For a long while neither spoke. The room breathed around them with the faint hum of heat vents and the soft settling clicks old buildings make in cold weather. On the table near Naomi's notes lay the fountain pen, now in a simple leather sleeve worn at the edges from use. She touched it once, then withdrew her hand. Richard glanced at the small brass nameplate newly installed outside the glass, visible in reflection more than directly. Strategic Risk Advisory. He seemed almost humbled by the fact of it. At 9 o'clock directors began arriving. Some greeted Naomi by name. Some asked brief questions and listened to the answers. No one made a show of respect. It moved instead through ordinary gestures, the deepest kind. Richard took his usual seat but not before pulling out the chair beside him, leaving it open without comment. Naomi sat there as naturally as if the room had always expected her. The meeting began. Numbers were reviewed. Governance reforms advanced. Voices rose and softened in the rhythm of work. Yet beneath the routine something irreversible remained, not dramatic enough for headlines, too human for markets to price. Midway through discussion Richard looked toward Naomi while another director spoke and gave the slightest nod, almost invisible. Not command. Recognition. She returned to her notes. Outside, snowmelt slid from a window ledge and vanished in sunlight. Hours later when the room emptied again, Naomi lingered alone for a moment before leaving. She turned once toward the city, palm resting lightly against the cool glass. Her breath made a small cloud that faded almost at once. Down on the avenue people moved in hurried lines, taxis flashed yellow through wet streets, life continuing indifferent and immense. She picked up her folder, the fountain pen, and walked down the long corridor where afternoon light lay warm across the floor. Her footsteps were soft, measured, unhurried. At the far end Richard stood speaking with no one, simply watching her go with an expression too still to name. Then Naomi disappeared around a corner, and only the quiet remained, carrying with it the strange sound of justice when it no longer needs to speak.